People are going missing all over North America under baffling circumstances. In some cases, people will be looking right at someone, they'll turn around and turn back and they're gone. Or you'll have instances where people will go missing and then turn up again in places that are basically impossible to get to. One man named David Paulides, who's a former police detective, when he learned about some of these strange cases and saw that no one was looking into it, he began to do the research and he spent tens of thousands of hours researching thousands of these cases, and they're so bizarre. As I read through them, I'm taking note of the really strange cases and highlighting those on my YouTube channel. But before we get into today's Missing 411 stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all I do, and I upload 3, 4, even 5 times every week. If that's of interest to you, then please offer the like button a Coke, but secretly swap it out with Pepsi. Also subscribe to this channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of my weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's stories. In 1969, Robert Winters was a 78-year-old retired logger living in Oregon. He was a family man, he loved the outdoors, and he really loved going hunting with his 3 sons. In early October 1969, Robert and his 3 sons headed off for their annual hunting trip that they would do at Sparks Lake. Now, Sparks Lake is an area that they had been hunting for 20 years. They know this area inside and out. They arrive at Sparks Lake and they set up their camp right at the base of this mountain that was a part of the area that they would be hunting in. And for the first couple of days, everything was going great. On October 8th, they found out that there was this big snowstorm coming in later that night. They still wanted to go hunting that day, so they decided that instead of going up into that mountain and hunting up there, they would stay at lower elevation around where their camp was. So the 4 of them split up and they took up different positions all around this lake, but they're all in the same general vicinity, and they all hunt for the day, and then they all come back to the campsite that night. Except Robert didn't come back, and as it got darker and the snow started to fall, his sons got really worried and they went out looking for him, but quickly saw that we got to get other people involved in this because this snowstorm's coming in and we don't know where he is. So they call the sheriff's office. The sheriff's department launches this massive search right away, but unfortunately, over the first 24 hours, not only did they not find Robert or any sign of where he was, but over 18 inches of snow dumped all over the area. Because of the snowfall, it made searching the area on foot really difficult, so they called in a couple helicopters to scour the area from the air. And it was at this time that one of the helicopters picked up tracks at 7,100 feet right near the lake. And the tracks were actually discounted, and people said that can't be Robert's, because that would mean he would have had to go up almost 2,000 feet in elevation when he and his sons had all agreed we're not going to go higher because of the snow. And Robert was an accomplished outdoorsman that would know in an emergency survival situation, especially in a cold environment, you don't go uphill. Temperatures drop as you go uphill, risk of hypothermia increases, plus you're burning more energy trying to get up a mountain. So they said that cannot be Robert's tracks. 5 days after Robert went missing, no sign of him has been found, and the search was terminated. 9 months later, a doctor was on vacation in the same area near Sparks Lake, and he discovered next to a tree up around that area where those tracks had been found by the helicopter at 7,100 feet, he found lying against a tree a rifle, some clothes, a boot, a glove, and a pair of glasses. The doctor informed the sheriff's department, who came out and confirmed that these all belonged to Robert Winters, but oddly enough, there was no blood anywhere on the clothes. And there were no bone fragments or any remains anywhere in the area because they brought searchers out and combed that whole area. So there was no indication that Robert had actually even died. Even stranger was, it looked like the clothes had been removed on purpose. Everything was stacked neatly next to this tree. The only other new piece of evidence that we would ever find about him is a year later, his dentures were found in that area. So again, there's no remains of Robert, just his various belongings that were found in that area. The family wanted to move forward with funeral arrangements, but they needed the coroner to sign a death certificate. The coroner refused for over a year, saying there's no sign he actually died. But Eventually, the coroner said it's also impossible for him to be alive at this point, so they were able to get a death certificate even though there was nothing ever found of him. It seems very unlikely that Robert, who was a skilled outdoorsman who had hunted this particular area for 20 years and had agreed with his sons that it was a bad idea to go up in elevation because of the storm, defied all of that and went almost 2,000 feet up in elevation, removed his clothes neatly and put them on the ground next to a tree, and then vanished without a trace. But then how do we reconcile those tracks that were seen from the helicopter up near where all of his belongings were found? Unless those tracks weren't Robert's. On February 19th, 1999, Dr. Catherine Wong, who was a pediatrician in San Jose, California, she was 47 years old. She and her husband, John, along with 2 relatives and 2 of their 3 kids, drove 4 hours northeast from their home in Milpitas, California, to Bear Valley Ski Resort. The family loved to go skiing any chance they could, so Dr. Wong was actually a fairly skilled skier. This would be their first time at Bear Valley Ski Resort, which is a resort located about 30 miles south of Lake Tahoe. The Wongs arrive, they start skiing, it's this beautiful day. At about 11:30 in the morning, everybody stops and goes into the lodge for lunch. After lunch, their kids and the other relatives decide to stay in the lodge for a little bit longer, so Dr. Wong and her husband John decide to go skiing on their own. And at some point, Dr. Wong and John decide to go down separate trails. John goes down his trail, and Dr. Wong will go down her trail, which was not a difficult trail. It's one she'd been on earlier in the day, and she doesn't show up at the bottom. John's down at the bottom, he's waiting for her. After a little bit of time, he starts to think, okay, maybe she got hurt, maybe she fell down, I'm not sure. He starts making his way over and looking up the trail. He can't see anything. There's no indication that someone's been hurt. And he starts looking for another 20, 30 minutes. Can't find her. Ski patrol goes up and they're looking for tracks coming off of the trail, a sign that maybe someone fell off and went into the woods. But there's no tracks anywhere of somebody leaving the trail. So the ski patrol gets in touch with the sheriff's office, who come out and launch an absolutely massive search. But by the end of the day, there was no sign of Dr. Wong, and even more strangely, they had searched all 75 trails on Bear Valley Ski Resort, and there was not one indication that someone had skied off of any of the trails or even walked off any of the trails. The search continued for another 2 days, no sign of Dr. Wong. They began reviewing all of the security footage, and any instance where she was on camera, there seemed to be nothing wrong. At the end of that second day, the weather got much worse, temperatures dropped, and this huge snowstorm rolled in, and the folks in charge of the search decided it was too dangerous to continue. Plus, at this point, they believed that it was impossible for Dr. Wong to even still be alive. At this point, they told the family that they are considering Dr. Wong deceased, and they terminated the search. It was around this time that newspapers and people in the area began to speculate that this was not an accident, that either Dr. Wong willingly decided to vanish or foul play was involved. There was no proof of either one, but it just seemed so bizarre that there was this massive search and there was just no sign of her anywhere, no tracks, no anything. It just felt like something's amiss here, we just don't know what it is. Her husband John ended up taking a lie detector test, which he passed, and investigators began digging into their marriage a bit to see if there was some underlying problems, and it looked for all the world like it was 20 years of a very stable, healthy, happy relationship. There was no sign that Dr. Wong would be looking to, escape her life and run off with someone else. 4 months after she went missing, her remains and ski equipment were found about a half-mile south of the ski resort in this deep ravine, heavily forested, well off any marked trail. Bone fragments and remains were scattered over a quarter-mile trail along this ravine. This area had not been previously searched because when they initially launched this search for her, this area was so steep and so difficult to get to, plus there was 8-foot snow drifts from the ski resort all the way to that area, that they decided it would have been impossible for her to get there. So how did she end up in this impossible area, and why weren't there any tracks leaving the mountain? Some say the scarcity and dispersal of her bones over that quarter-mile track indicates that after she had been deceased, animals had kind of ravaged her remains. Others say that an animal is responsible for this attack, and that's why her remains are scattered over a quarter-mile track in this impossible area. But what kind of an animal is able to sneak up and grab a person off of a very populated ski resort and drag them this half-mile away without leaving any tracks or raising any suspicion? In 1991, Corey Fay was a 17-year-old high school student in Beaverton, Oregon. On November 23, 1991, Corey and two of his friends decided to go elk hunting. Corey was not an avid hunter, but he went hunting enough that he was competent, and he had taken survival training and was always very well equipped anytime he went out on a hunt. So the three of them load up in a truck, they make their way out to this hunting site, and when they get there, they decide to split up and meet back up at the truck at 6:30 that night. That night at 6:30, the other two hunters came back to the truck, but not Corey. He was nowhere to be found. The other two hunters briefly went out looking for Corey, and they couldn't find him, so they called the sheriff's department, who comes out and they launch this absolutely epic search. They had helicopters, they had horse teams, they had 250 ground searchers. They had 7 of the world's best scent sniffing dogs in the whole world are a part of this search. In over 10 days, that group covered 12 square miles where Corey would have been. Towards the end of this 10-day period, when this all-star search team has come up with nothing, people began to wonder if the other two hunters had accidentally shot and killed Corey and maybe buried him. But those search dogs never found a gravesite. The official search was called off on December 1st, but many volunteers stayed out for weeks and weeks, combing the area, going well beyond the bounds of that initial 12-mile area they searched, and nothing was ever found. The sheriff's department that was in charge of this search was so perplexed by the fact that this amazing team of searchers couldn't find anything that they ended up contacting the FBI, which indicates they were suspecting foul play, because that's the only reason the FBI would get involved. But almost nothing happened in Corey's case for nearly a year. In September of 1992, two hunters were hunting about 10 miles away from where Corey had gone missing, and they discover a rifle, a backpack, and a jacket. They don't know whose it is, so they turn it over to the sheriff's department. The sheriff's department comes out, and they're able to confirm that they all belonged to Corey Fay. A new search was ordered right around that area where his belongings were found, and all these searchers came out and did a grid search, and all they could find were a couple of bone fragments and his tooth. No large bones, no rib cage, no skull, nothing. And interestingly, they also never found his pants or his boots. But now that they had some of his remains, the sheriff's department was looking at where they were found and looking at the time of the year when he had gone missing, and they realized that to go from where he went missing to 10 miles away, 3,000 feet up in elevation to where some of his remains were found, he would have been in waist-deep snow for over 5 miles. People were skeptical about him making this trek because it didn't make sense, but his family in particular really didn't believe it. Corey's grandparents said in an interview that Corey had taken these survival courses that he would talk about all the time, and one of the main things they teach you is in a survival situation when you're on a mountain, in particular when it's cold, you never go up. If you go up in elevation, temperatures will drop, the risk of hypothermia increases. So for him to have wound up 10 miles away and 3,000 feet up in elevation is basically doing the opposite of what he was trained to do. And his grandparents said that Corey was incredibly level-headed. There's no reason that in a real survival situation that he would have just thrown that out the window. He would have relied on his training. So the million-dollar question is, why are his belongings and bone fragments 10 miles away and 3,000 feet up in elevation? Did he defy his training and go there on his own, or did an animal attack him and drag him there? But if it's the latter, what kind of animal drags a 17-year-old, his rifle and his backpack 10 miles up 3,000 feet of elevation in over 6 feet of snow? And where is the rest of him? All we ever found were a couple of bone fragments and a tooth. So like all of these missing 411 cases, we're left with a lot of unanswered questions, because that's the whole deal with missing 411. These are baffling. But that doesn't stop us from speculating about what could be happening. And not only will I respond to the early commenters, I'll also pin the best theory at the top of the comments section. If you want to learn more about Missing 411, please check out David Paulides' book series called Missing 411. I provided a link in the description below where you can purchase those books. Also, David Paulides has a YouTube channel that I provided in the description below as well. Go over there, subscribe, and check out his content as well. I also have a Missing 411 playlist that anytime I do any episode like this, I put in there, so you can check that out too. If you enjoyed today's episode and you haven't done this already, please offer the like button a Coke, but secretly give it a Pepsi. Also, subscribe to this channel channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of my weekly uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username on both platforms is Ballen416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is Mr. Ballen. If you have a story suggestion that you think might fit this channel, please submit it to our subreddit called Mr. Ballen. I am on there every day, and if I intentionally use your suggestion, I will absolutely credit you. So whether I see you on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, Reddit, or some combination, I'm just incredibly thankful for your support. And that's going to do it, guys. Until next time, see ya. People are going missing in national parks and forests all over North America under baffling conditions. In some cases, people will be looking right at someone, they'll turn around, and when they turn back, that person's gone. Or people will go missing and then turn up again in locations that are impossible to get to. One man, a former police detective named David Paulides, discovered that there were thousands of these cases and no one was looking into it. So he began looking into it and started putting all of his findings in a totally fascinating book series called Missing 411. On today's video, I'm going to highlight 3 Missing 411 cases about people who went camping and then things went horribly, horribly wrong. But before we get into those stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right place, because that's all I do, and I upload 3, 4, even 5 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please offer your seat to the like button, and then when they go to sit down, pull the seat out from under them. Also, please subscribe to this channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of my weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's stories. In 1985, Kevin O'Keefe was a 36-year-old outdoor enthusiast that lived in Sacramento, California. He loved being out in nature, going hiking and camping, and in fact, he had always wanted to go camping in Alaska. By the summer of 1985, Kevin was actually doing research on areas in Alaska that he could potentially go camping, and he settled on this area called Glacier Bay National Park, which even by Alaskan standards is particularly wild and totally remote. Kevin planned to go camping on his own, so he decided he would need to take a class on how to survive the Alaskan wilderness because he's going to be out there by himself and he's chosen this place that's incredibly rugged. So he actually enrolled and participated in a class teaching you how to go camping in Alaska. Then on September 20th of 1985, he flew from Sacramento to Juneau, Alaska, where he commuted his way up to Glacier Bay National Park. When he arrived at the park's headquarters, he went up and introduced himself to the park rangers that were working there. He told them he'd be over near the Wolf Point area, which was an area right against the water, and he said he was going to be here for about 3 weeks. He planned on leaving on October 10th. So everybody who works there is aware that there's this guy, Kevin O'Keefe, who's going to be by himself for almost 3 weeks camping near the water. No one in Kevin's family or any of the park rangers heard from Kevin for the next couple of weeks. But the whole point of this trip was basically to escape reality and go live in nature for a few weeks, so no one's raising any red flags. A few weeks later, on October 8th, which is 2 days before Kevin said he was planning to leave the park, which he told park rangers and they knew he was there, a couple of park rangers were in a boat patrolling some waterways around Wolf Point, which is the area where Kevin was camping. The rangers decided to take a bit of a detour to get inside of Wolf Point and actually check in on Kevin and just see how he was doing, because they knew he was out here by himself. They're making their way down, and as they turned this last corner where they could finally see Kevin's sight, immediately they knew something was wrong. The first thing they noticed was Kevin's tent was not in the area that it was supposed to be in. There was kind of a designated spot on the soil where you'd place your tent, but his tent was actually down a few meters on this beach that butted up against his campsite, and some of his gear was outside of his tent. Not strewn everywhere, but outside of his tent, like you had placed it outside. As they're looking at his tent, they realized that the top strut that kind of held the top of the tent together was folded down. It looked like it had broken right in the middle. They called out for Kevin, he was nowhere around, and they kind of rationalized what they saw. They thought, he's leaving in a couple of days. My guess is he's probably preparing his campsite for an exit. Maybe he went out to, go on a day hike or something. I'm sure everything is fine. So they leave and come back the next day just to double check. And when they arrive, there's been no change. The tent is still sitting down on the beach with that strut collapsed. His gear is sitting outside of his tent like his sleeping bag and sleeping pad. It's clear that Kevin has not been to this campsite since the last time they saw him, which was 24 hours earlier. So now they're outright concerned and they decide to launch a search for Kevin. They began flying little airplanes over the area where Kevin's campsite was and the surrounding areas. No sign of Kevin. They brought ground searchers with dogs onto his campsite. They're looking everywhere. No sign of Kevin, but they did discover at his campsite that virtually all of the equipment you would expect to be at a campsite in Alaska of someone who's staying there for a few weeks, well, it was all there. He had his backpack fully packed as if he was going to go on a hike. It had food, it had extra clothes and water. It was all packed right up against a tree. All of his sleeping equipment and his cooking equipment. And oddly, there was lots of food that Kevin still had left at his campsite that was out in the open. And no animals had touched it, which is a complete anomaly. As they began searching the outer areas of his campsite, dogs were able to locate Kevin's boots, his glove liner, and his hat. They were tucked away in this gully about a half-mile away from this campsite. That they were not visible to the naked eye. It took dogs finding it to locate these items. After finding these items, the early speculation was it looks like Kevin was attacked by bears or some other predator. But the park rangers, who knew this area extremely well and had seen other bear attacks, said, I don't think this is a bear attack because there's no sign of a death struggle anywhere at his camp. If you get attacked by a big predator, you're going to fight for your life to save yourself. You're going to grab onto things and flail around. It's fairly obvious, and there's none of that. There's also no blood or remains or any indication that someone was hurt in this space. And if an animal had come into this camp and attacked Kevin and eaten Kevin, they certainly would have taken the food that was out and about in the campsite. But none of the food was touched. As the investigation continued, rangers would say how strange it was that no wild animals are coming into this campsite. There's no activity. There's nothing in the area. It's like the animals are staying away from Kevin's campsite. When they couldn't find any sign of Kevin, the investigators went to speak with Kevin's family and asked them, did he have any signs that he was looking to end his own life? Do you have any information you can give us about him? And they said, no, he was really happy, well-adjusted, excited about this trip. He had taken a class to prepare himself for this trip. He told us that he planned on taking a couple day hikes, but no overnights. And he had no plans to meet other people while he was there. He was just looking to be on his own in nature. But after just a few days, they had to call the search off because there was no sign of this guy. He was just gone. Knowing that all of Kevin's gear was still located at his campsite means he did not leave to go on one of those day hikes that he had told his family that he might be going on. Because going into the wilds of Alaska without your gear is a death sentence. So Kevin must have been at his campsite when something horrible happened to him. But we know it wasn't an animal attack because there was no sign of that and no animals were coming near this campsite. So if it wasn't an animal attack, then what was it that caused his tent to shift down to the beach and have his gear strewn about on the sand and have his boots and glove liner and hat be located a half-mile away in some gully? And where's Kevin? In 2000, Patrick Whalen was 33 years old, and he was described as being an outdoor enthusiast, bordering on full-blown survivalist. He had hiked thousands of miles across the Pacific Crest Trail and had spent hundreds of hours camping inside of national parks, in particular the Glacier National Park in Montana. That was his absolute favorite place to go. In fact, he spent so much time there that the park rangers recognized him and knew him by name. On November 2nd, 2000, Pat was driving in Kiowa Junction in Montana when he hit a deer. Witnesses say that he stopped his truck, he got out, walked over to the deer, pulled it to the side of the road, took a pillow out of his truck, put it under the deer's head, and then he went and got food from his truck and put it near the deer's mouth, and then he just walked away. He abandons his truck. It's unclear whether his truck was not operational at this point or if he was just abandoning his truck, but either way, his truck would get towed the next day. 6 months after the deer incident, Patrick's father called the park rangers at the Glacier National Park in Montana, and he said, I haven't heard from my son in months, and I'm worried about him. I can't get in touch with him. If there was one place he would be, it would be at your park. Have you seen him? The park rangers, who again, they all knew Pat, they said, we haven't seen him, but we'll keep an eye out for him. A couple of weeks later, 2 of these park rangers are out on a routine patrol through the park when they come across a very odd scene. They saw this blue tent sitting in the middle of this campsite. There's no one around it, and the middle strut that held the tent together was collapsed. They yelled out to see if anybody was inside the tent to make sure everything was okay, but no one calls back. They walk over to the tent itself, and they can tell that this tent has been out here for some time. It looks very weathered and sun-bleached, but there's no tears in the fabric, and all of the zippers are shut. When they opened up the tent, there was no one inside, but there were all the things you would expect to find inside of a tent at a campsite. Water, food, stove, boots, clothes, it's all in there. But again, the tent is collapsed, and based on the pattern of sun bleaching on the outside, it had been collapsed for some time. When the park rangers filed their report about what they found, they noted that it was really odd that no animals had ransacked this tent, because clearly it had been sitting here unoccupied for a while and there was food in the tent, but no animals had touched it. Authorities show up and they begin searching the area for Pat. There's no sign of him. They bring out cadaver sniffing dogs. They don't pick up any scent. One of the issues they were up against was they had no idea how long it had been since he had arrived here and then subsequently disappeared, because they actually went to the tow yard where he had had his truck towed following hitting that deer 6 months earlier, and his truck was still sitting in the tow lot. So he hadn't claimed his truck. That was 6 months earlier, and here we are, and there's this tent in the middle of the woods, and we have no idea where he is. But the most interesting and terrifying thing that was discovered was inside of his tent, there was an empty buck knife case. So the sheath was there, no knife. David Paulides offers a very interesting theory about why it was there. He suggests that while Patrick was living at this campsite, he must have been in his tent one night and he hears something outside of his tent that apparently was formidable enough that he felt the need to take his knife out and go out into the open to confront it. He gets out. The mosquitoes were very bad in that area, so he probably hopped out, zipped his tent shut for a minute. He's standing there with his knife to confront whatever this is, and then he doesn't go back into his tent. Whatever was out there apparently got the best of Pat. But we can't just say he was attacked by an animal, because there was no blood, there was no remains, there was no sign of a death struggle in that campground, and the food that was in his tent was untouched. No animal had tried to rip open the tent to get to the food, something that animals do after they attack people at their campsites. So the million-dollar question is, if it wasn't a wild animal that he was getting out of his tent with his knife to confront, then who or what was it? And where's Patrick? In April of 1976, 19-year-old Stephen Thomas was asked by his good friend Bruce Weaver if he wanted to join Bruce and Bruce's 4 other friends on a hike in New York State. Steve didn't know these 4 others, but he really liked Bruce and he loved hiking, so he agreed to go. The mountain they were going to climb was Mount Marcy. It's one of the biggest mountains on the East Coast, and it's very rugged, it's very windy, the temperatures drop dramatically towards the summit. It's a dangerous place unless you treat it with respect. On the morning that Steve was leaving for this hike, his mother told him that she had a bad feeling about the hike and that maybe he should just cancel, because it didn't seem like a good idea to be hiking such a rugged mountain with people he didn't know. But Steve, who had a lot of experience hiking, said it was totally fine, he was eager to go, and that he would see her in a couple of days. On April 12th, 1976, the 6 men are making their way up Mount Marcy, and they get near the summit by about 3:30 p.m. in the afternoon, and even though they could have pressed on and made their way up to the summit, they were all really exhausted from the trip so far, and they decided they would make camp where they were and they would attack the summit the next day, and they were all eager to do that, with the exception of Steve. Steve didn't want to stop. Steve was sitting in Bruce's tent looking at the map of Mount Marcy, and he said to Bruce, "Hey, do you want to go for a quick walk with me? I just want to walk up the path a little ways." And Bruce was like, "No, man, I'm tired. Let's just go tomorrow." And so Steve just continued to stay up looking at this map. He made tea for himself, and at some point, he folded the map up and said, "Hey, Bruce, I'm just going to walk up the path a little ways. I'll be right back." Bruce told Steve this was a bad idea. Don't go up there on your own. The temperatures are dropping. It's getting dark. It's windy. It's just a disaster waiting to happen. Plus, we're all going to be up there first thing in the morning, so there's no reason to go up right now. But Steve was like, I just don't want to sit here. I'm going to just go. So Steve begins to walk out. The other hikers that he didn't know too well are like, "Hey, man, just stay here." But again, Steve's not listening, and Steve continues up the trail. When Steve left, he must have thought he was only going to be gone for a few minutes, because he threw on a rain jacket, this yellow rain jacket, over a t-shirt and pants, because he'd been sitting in a warm tent. He just threw on a jacket, and he left his backpack. He just walked out with no supplies and began walking up this trail. At the time Steve was walking down that path, the snow was very hard packed, so it was easy to walk on, and there was a full moon, so there was great visibility. So it was a good night to be doing what Steve was doing, albeit if it had just been for a few minutes. So as Steve is walking away from the camp, even though the other hikers were annoyed with him, they weren't concerned. He had loads of hiking experience in Washington State. He was very eager to do this. And again, it was well lit. The snow was hard packed. They're thinking, okay, he'll be gone for a couple of minutes and then we'll see him again and it'll be just fine. After about an hour, it was dark and the temperatures are now well below freezing, and Steve has not come back yet, and he was not dressed for the sub-freezing temperatures. So the hikers walk a little ways down the path and they're yelling out for Steve, but there's no response. They decide that they have to go up the path and look for him because the conditions are going to kill him if he doesn't come back and get in his tent soon. When they go back to their tent to get some of their equipment to go make this trek to go find Steve, one of those 4 hikers that Steve did not know particularly well had brought his dog along for this hike, which apparently he always did. This dog was highly energetic, went everywhere with this guy. He loved hiking. Anytime the dog could go out and go run around, it would do it in a heartbeat. And when this hiker went in his tent to not only get his own gear, but to get his dog and bring his dog with him to go look for Steve, the dog refused to leave the tent. In fact, it cowered in the back of the tent and acted like it was scared of something that was outside of the tent. The dog's owner would tell investigators later that he's never seen his dog act that way. He was acting scared of something to the point where he would stay in the tent and all the hikers would go looking for Steve. The dog would rather be alone in a tent, totally isolated, than leave that tent. That's how scared he was of whatever it was that was out there. So the men go out looking and they can't find Steve. And after a little bit, they end up going back because it's just so dangerous to look for him in the middle of the night. So the group heads back to their tents and they're just praying that he found shelter somewhere on the mountain. The next morning, as soon as the sun came up, the hikers immediately start looking for Steve, yelling for Steve. There's no sign of him. And at some point, half the group leaves and walks the 4 hours down the trail to a vehicle where they could go drive and get authorities, while the other 3 continue to look and stay near the camp just in case Steve were to return. Once authorities were notified, they launched one of the largest search and rescue efforts in the history of New York. They spent 2 weeks combing this entire mountain. Helicopters, dog teams, searchers on the ground, they are looking everywhere. There is no sign of Steve, even though he had this bright yellow jacket on. They can't find anything. He's just totally gone. After the official search was terminated after about 2 weeks, Steve's older brother, Bob, who is 26 years old, in amazing shape and very close with his brother Steve, he quits his job and moves to the Mount Marcy area and spent a whole year searching every inch of this mountain. Veteran park rangers at Mount Marcy would joke that Bob knew the mountain better than they did. Bob had apparently walked over 2,500 miles on Mount Marcy and had summited 600 times or more, and every time he would take a different route and search all along the mountain. He has looked everywhere and he can't find his brother. Although Bob would never find his brother, he did locate the remains of a hiker who had gone missing 3 years earlier, so he was able to provide closure for that family. So why did Steve feel the need to walk up this trail in the first place? And then what was the dog so scared of after Steve vanished? Because the dog never acted that way, but suddenly something was so terrifying on the outside of their tents that it abandoned its owner and huddled in the tent in fear. And then how could Bob have missed his brother Steve, who was wearing a bright yellow jacket after combing every inch of this mountain? The only logical answer is that Steve is not on the mountain. But if he's not on the mountain, where is he? So like all of the missing 411 cases, we don't know what happened to these people, and we probably never will. But that doesn't stop us from theorizing about what could have happened to them. So get in the comments and give me your best theory about what's happening to these people. And not only will I get back to all the early commenters, I'll also pin the best comment at the top of the comment section. If you enjoyed today's story and you haven't done this already, please offer the like button your seat, and then when they go to sit down, pull the seat out from behind them. Also subscribe to this channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of my weekly uploads. If you want to learn more about the missing 411 phenomenon, I would encourage you to check out the Missing 411 book series by David Paulides. He's the one who created Missing 411. He's the one doing all the research. He's incredible. I put a link below in the description of how to purchase his books. I've also included his YouTube channel where he talks about a lot of these cases as well. I also have a Missing 411 playlist that I've included in the description below. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's Ballen416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is Mr. Ballen. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit. It's just called Mr. Ballen. It's linked in the description below. I read that every day, and if I intentionally use your suggestion, I will absolutely credit you. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, YouTube, Reddit, some combination, I'm just incredibly thankful for your support. And until next time, guys, that's going to do it. See ya. 40 years after a U.S. Army soldier went missing on this desolate Alaskan island, researchers make a startling discovery that changes everything about that case. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right channel because that's all we do, and we upload 3, 4, even 5 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please sneak up behind the like button and viciously rear naked choke them. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's stories. On October 9th, 2010, 2-year-old Rowan Griffin was in the backseat of the car next to his 2 older siblings, and his father was driving the car. And they were on their way to this big family party at Rowan's grandparents' house. They lived in Richmond, New Hampshire, which is a pretty rural part of New Hampshire, and their house was literally in the woods. You had to go down this really long driveway to get to it, and it was this single-story home where they had cleared out all the trees in the backyard to kind of clear a space to have these awesome cookouts for family get-togethers. And so Rowan, his 2 siblings, and his dad, they get to the entrance of the driveway that's going to bring them up to the house, and they can already tell there's tons of people here because there's cars lining the driveway all the way out to the street. And so they make their way up the driveway, and sure enough, right in the backyard is just a sea of adults and teenagers and kids. It's this huge family reunion, and Rowan and his 2 siblings just take off running to go play with their cousins. And so for the next couple of hours, the kids were just running around having a great time, and the adults are having a good time. And at some point, the adults started to notice, after the fact, they would say they noticed this, they started to notice Rowan was chasing a cat. There was a cat that lived at the grandparents' house, and he loved the cat, and he was chasing it all around the backyard. And at some point, Rowan ran into the woods to chase after this cat. And a number of adults saw him do that, but it was like mob mentality, where they each thought somebody else was watching Rowan. They were not trying to be negligent. They just figured there's so many people here, what can go wrong? In a very short period of time, Mr. Griffin realizes he can't find his son. And so he goes to the kids and he's like, hey, have you seen Rowan? And they're like, oh yeah, I think he was chasing a cat. I think he was over there. And then Mr. Griffin asks the adults and they say the same thing. Yeah, he's chasing a cat. I think he was over there. And after looking around for him and everybody basically saying he was chasing this cat and not being able to find him, he just started yelling to the group, hey, everybody stop for a second. I can't find Rowan. Everyone's telling me he's chasing a cat. Well, then can you tell me where he went? I don't know where he is. And pretty quickly they realize he's not in the house. He's not in the backyard. He's not at the end of the driveway. He's not in any of the cars. He's not here. And very quickly, the group started yelling for Rowan. They're running out into the woods. They're looking for him. And Mr. Griffin is like, I don't know how long he's been gone for. And so he calls 911 right then and there. He's not taking any chances. And so the police come out and they launch this huge search. And then all these locals in the area that had ATVs and 4-wheelers, they came out and they're driving around the forest looking for Rowan. Everybody's yelling for him. There's hundreds of people out there. But as the sun started to fade, they still hadn't found him. They had found no indication of where he went. They assumed he made it out into the forest because the last sign of him was he was chasing a cat into the forest potentially, but they really didn't know. And so finally the sun does go down that night and they have to postpone the search until first light the next morning. And you can only imagine how horrible that was for Rowan's parents as they're sitting inside that night wondering what's happening to their 2-year-old son who's just out in the woods by himself. So very early the next morning, a whole bunch of volunteers went right back out into the woods to look for Rowan. There was this one particular group that wanted to look a little bit farther away than where everybody else was looking. They were going to be about 3+ miles away in this swamp. And so this group of searchers, they start walking into this swamp and they can tell right away that it's a very wet and deep swamp. They would take a step onto something that looked solid and they would sink 2-3 feet into the water. They all had waders on so they wouldn't get wet. but they were basically sludging through this swamp, and it was very thick. And at some point, they make their way through a clearing, and they see on a log what looks like a pair of children's shoes, or shoes for sure. They look small enough to be kids. And so they wade their way over and they climb up onto this dry section of land and they walk over, and sure enough, they're kids' shoes. And so they yell out for him a couple times and then they stop to listen. And after a minute, they hear him call back. He's yelling, "Here!" And they walk their way past this huge bush and they look through and they can't believe it. They see Rowan right in the middle of this bog of water. There is a tree that is right in the middle of this, and he's clutched onto the tree. He looks dry, he looks okay, and he's just standing on this island holding this tree. And so immediately the searchers jump right in the water and they start wading their way out to this island where Rowan is. And the whole time they're going out there, the water's, up to their chest, and they're looking around, and it's at least that deep all the way around this thing. And they're looking up at the kid, and he's bone dry, and he's 2 years old. So they don't know if he knows how to swim or not. And so they're thinking to themselves, how did he get out here? But either way, they're like, let's just get the kid and bring him back to his parents. And so they finally hop up onto this island and they kind of look over Rowan. He seems okay. They pick him up and they keep him out of the water and they bring him back to land and back to his parents. Initially, Rowan's parents and the police and the searchers, everybody is just so happy that Rowan is alive that no one is asking any questions about, what happened and, what's the deal with you being found on that island? How'd you get out there? People are just leaving it alone. They're just happy he's here. But after the dust had settled, so to speak, Rowan's parents would ask him some questions. They would say, what happened? How'd you get lost? And how'd you get on that island? And at first, Rowan was just not saying anything, but eventually he would say that there were cows out there. And he said that he was scared of the cows, and that's why he went to the island, because he wanted to get away from the cows. Now, there were no cows in that swamp or anywhere near where he was that night. So either he didn't see anything and he was hallucinating seeing animals at all, or he was mislabeling something else that he was seeing. But whatever he was seeing or believed he was seeing, it scared the heck out of him, and he would get really frightened when he would talk about these cows. But regardless of what he saw or didn't see, the million-dollar question is, how did he get out to that island? Because in order to get out to that island, for him, being a 2-year-old, being the size he was, he would have had to swim. The water was too deep all the way around the island, and he didn't know how to swim. But even if he had found a way to magically swim out to this island, why wasn't he wet? It's also worth noting this all took place just a few miles away from the infamous Bennington Triangle, which is this area in southern Vermont where there's been a whole string of people going missing under very mysterious circumstances. In 1953, 11-year-old Jerry Monkman was considered a very frail child. He was skinnier than his peers, he was shorter than his peers, and he had a really bad case of asthma, which was a breathing condition that made doing anything physical really difficult. But despite his perceived fragility, he loved going outside, he loved hiking, and he was a proud member of the Boy Scouts. And so on April 25th of that year, Jerry was really excited when he found out his Boy Scout troop was offering a trip to the Rocky Mountain foothills to go camping and hiking for a weekend, and he jumped at the opportunity. So Jerry, his troop, and his troop leaders, they all pile in a van and they make their way up to the Rocky Mountains, and as soon as they get there, they go on this wickedly rugged hike up in the Teton Canyon, and about an hour into their trip, one of the troop leaders turns around and Jerry's gone. The troop leaders did not know how long he had been gone for, so they only searched for a couple of minutes before one of them ran down the mountain to try to get help. Soon the sheriff's department arrived, and 1,600 volunteers from the town that had heard about this, they all poured out onto the mountain, and they are combing across this mountain to find Jerry as quickly as possible. But after several hours, they couldn't find him, and people started to think the worst. And then just then, the bloodhound they had brought out to try to track his scent picked up Jerry's scent, and it starts taking off up the trail. And the handler of the dog tells everyone, hey, he's picked him up. We're going to find him. We're going to find him. And he thinks the dog's going to lead him to him, within a mile or so of where they are. But the dog just stays on a complete beeline for 6 hours. It just tracks straight north for 6 hours until it comes to this big swamp where it stops. Like, I found it. This is where it ends. This swamp was 12 miles away from where Jerry had gone missing. So the handler and the people that had followed this dog, they searched the swamp because even though they thought it was totally improbable that Jerry, this frail 11-year-old with asthma, would have maneuvered 12 miles uphill through rugged terrain to the swamp, they still felt like they needed to search it. So they searched the swamp, there wasn't anything there. And so the dog handler's thinking, okay, my dog must have made a mistake. And so he gives the scent again to the dog, thinking the dog will turn and start heading back towards where Jerry had gone missing. But instead, his dog basically just reconfirms that, nope, this is where the scent brought me, I'm still right. And so the dog handler and everybody else that had made this long, treacherous 12-mile journey up to the swamp, they just decided that the dog must have made a mistake and the kid could never have been here. The next morning at 8 a.m., an 8-year-old boy named David was riding his horse about 30 miles away from where Jerry had gone missing. And he happened to be looking over at the tree line, and a boy stumbles out of the tree line and waves to him. And so David goes over, and it turns out it's Jerry Monkman. Jerry would just tell David that he needs to get back to his group. And David would say, what are you doing out here? And Jerry just said, I don't really know. I need to get back to my group. I was with a group yesterday, and I need to get back to them. And apparently David asked him, well, how did you get here if you were with them yesterday? And all Jerry could say was, I fell asleep under a tree. I don't know. When word got back to the searchers that they had found Jerry and they had found him 30 miles away, they couldn't believe it. The day before, it had been unbelievable that he could have traveled 12 miles to that swamp. Like literally unbelievable. They didn't believe it. Nope, he couldn't have done it. And now clearly he's traveled at least 30 miles to have been found by David where he was found. And that's 30 miles as the crow flies, meaning overhead air miles, 30 miles. The reality is when you're walking in the wilderness, you don't walk in straight lines. You make turns and you go left, there's switchbacks. And the area he must have gone through over those 30 miles is all unmarked. It's this rugged, hilly, awful, unmarked terrain. So for sure, he probably covered 40 plus miles to get there. And so the police asked him, how did you do this? How did you cover the distance you covered in such a short amount of time? And Jerry would say he just remembers sleeping under a tree and then waking up, and he would see animals poking their heads around from behind different trees. And he didn't know what kind of animals they were, but they were watching him, and he was worried they were going to hurt him, but they didn't. And he said he was able to just keep walking, and he would keep sleeping under these trees, and he kept seeing these animals that were watching him, and he just kept saying, they never hurt me. They never hurt me. And so obviously this did not answer any of the questions that the investigators were looking to answer. And they just felt like, okay, maybe he's in shock and we can ask him at another time. But the theory became like, well, then he must have been abducted to have covered this distance. But that begs the question, who's capable of moving an 11-year-old that much distance in such a short amount of time? We're talking about a 30-hour window, moving potentially 50 plus miles, lugging an 11-year-old around. And then even if there was someone or something that was capable of lifting up an 11-year-old and maneuvering them that much distance in such a short amount of time, well, to what end? Why would they do that? Why was Jerry then maneuvered to the swamp and then maneuvered to where he was found? It doesn't make any sense. One of the most remote places in the world is Buldir Island in Alaska. It's 2/3 of the way to Russia along the Aleutian chain of islands. The nearest inhabited island is about 50 miles away. The weather on Buldir Island is pretty brutal, especially during the winter, and there's no electricity there. In 1944, the United States Army decided they wanted to send 5 of their soldiers to monitor the weather station on Buldir Island. That was like the one thing the island was used for. And so one of the people that was sent on this assignment was a guy by the name of Bud Houston. Bud was born in Wisconsin and worked in a shipyard before enlisting in the Army in 1942. He was a big hunter and outdoorsman, and so the prospect of living on this kind of desolate Alaskan island really appealed to him, and he was excited about the assignment. In October of that year, Bud was flown out to Buldir Island, and he met with the other 4 soldiers that were going to be living on the island with him. It was going to be those 5 on the island. No one else is there. And they quickly learned their job of monitoring the weather station was a very low effort job. And so they could do all of their tasks over the course of the day pretty easily, and it freed up a lot of time for them to explore the island. And that would actually become their favorite pastime because there really wasn't much else to do there except explore the island. And so very quickly they became very familiar with the whole island because it wasn't that big. It was about maybe 2.5 miles wide by 4.5 miles long. On March 3rd, 1945, so 5 months after they've arrived on Buldir Island, so by now they know every square inch of the island, they're very comfortable here. They had to do a routine patrol around the weather station. This was something they did multiple times a week, so very routine. And all 5 of them are sitting in the weather station, and Bud says he'll do it. So Bud gets his rifle and he heads outside to do this patrol. And the other 4 are just sitting in the weather station, and after about an hour, they realize Bud hasn't come back yet. And this patrol does not take more than 20 minutes. And so they step outside to see if he's out there, and the weather at the time was very mild. You know, there's no snow on the ground, it's not very cold, it's not very windy, and the visibility this night was pretty good. And so they're looking out over the island, and the island has no trees. At the very far end, at the opposite end of where the weather station is, there's one significant sized mountain. But short of that, it's not particularly mountainous. So from their perspective, they could look out over the island and basically see everything, and they don't see him anywhere. At first, they were not that worried about it because they figure, you know what, he knows what he's doing, he's been here so long, he's probably just out exploring or something. But they decided they would go look for him. They go down to the water, he's not down there. They walk all around the far side of the island, they can't find him. And so by the time they get back to the weather station, they were like, we have to tell the command that we've lost him. So they radio back to higher command and they say, we don't know where he went. He went out on patrol and we didn't hear anything. And now he's gone. And so a whole bunch of reinforcements came out to the island to look on foot with the other 4 soldiers, as well as planes and helicopters. And for 2 days, they looked all over that island for Bud, and they couldn't find him. And you got to remember that there's very few places you could possibly even go on the island that they wouldn't be able to look and see you. And so everyone started to think he must have jumped into the water or fallen into the water, because there's nowhere for him to hide on the island. And so after a couple of days, they were so sure that it was just not possible for him to be on the island that they called the search off and they said he must have fallen into the water. Fast forward 40 years to 1988, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service was studying birds on Bull Deer Island, and they made this amazing discovery. This crew had set up their camp at 1,600 feet of elevation on the one large mountain on the far side of the island, basically on the opposite end of the island from the weather station. And one of the crew members happened to just walk around one of the boulders, and they looked down and there was this little tiny crevice between the boulder and the ground, and he thought he saw something inside of it. And he got down and he looked and he realized there was a skeleton that had been kind of crammed into this tiny little tight space. And the skeleton had a military uniform on. It had been kind of balled up, but there was a uniform on what was left of the skeleton, and there was also a rifle that had been jammed down in there as well. And it would turn out to be Bud Houston. So why did Bud say he was going to go outside and do that patrol, which really just meant walking around the immediate vicinity of the weather station? You're certainly not traveling very far. Why did he say he was going to do that and then walk 4.5 miles to the other end of the island and then climb up 1,500 feet to the top of this mountain? But even if he had a reason to be over there, why would he then force himself into this little tiny crevice? If he was looking for shelter, well, the weather was incredibly mild. It would not have been life-threatening to be out in the elements, at least not that first night or even that second night. And he knows the island like the back of his hand. He probably had a little bit more time. He probably could have found a better place for shelter than this awful little crevice. But if he was at a place where he was seeking shelter under these boulders instead of just walking back to the weather station and getting real shelter, then he had to have been in an emergency situation. That's the only way that makes sense. But if he was in an emergency situation, he would know that his responsibility is not just to survive, it's also to be found again and to make sure you're not obscured underneath a boulder so no one can find you. This island, it was like the easiest place to be found. There's no trees. There was helicopters overhead and planes, and there's all these people. It's a small space. All he had to do was not be under the boulder 24/7. Maybe during the day when the weather let up, roll out from under the boulder. Let yourself be found. But that's not what happened. What probably happened is Bud somehow got crammed into that little tiny crevice almost immediately after he left the weather station to do that patrol. But logically speaking, he would not do that to himself. So someone else had to do it. But all the other people on the island were in the weather station at the time this would have been happening. So it really makes you wonder, what happened when he walked outside of that weather station? Who or what did he see, and what did they do to him? Unfortunately, we'll probably never know. So that's going to do it, guys. I hope you enjoyed today's stories. Let me know in the comments if you found the secret. Tell us what it is and where you found it. Give us the timestamp. And if you're the first to do that, we'll pin you at the top of the comments section. If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already, please sneak up behind the like button and viciously rear naked choke them. Also, please subscribe to this channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 3, 4, even 5 video uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's Ballen416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is Mr. Ballen. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called Mr. Ballen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya.